Hello and welcome to Goat. Any last words? I'm Sergeant White.
I am CI.
And this week's topic is...
Well, it's my turn to do all the information bits today. And we are going to... It's a good one. It's a good one. It's a little bit more expansive than the last episode.
What are you saying about why?
I'm not saying anything. I don't know what you're talking about. So last week we obviously went through rockets, which was really interesting. Went through the history of rockets.
Yep.
How
Do you remember?
rockets set off.
Yeah, do you remember any of it?
I remember that rockets are quite hot. 3,318 degrees Celsius, I think they were. That's how hot they got.
Yeah.
Because I'm a genius. This week, we're going to talk about what is in the space around Earth. So what do we have in our atmosphere? What is floating around in our atmosphere? And why is it important? And why is it potentially dangerous? What are the uses of those things?
Okay.
And then we're going to talk about some pioneers of space exploration. So we're going to talk about a cute little dog. We're going to talk about the first woman in space, the first British person in space, and the first space tourist. Because that's talks that have sort of happened in the last few years where people... do you remember Richard Branson from Virgin said that you were going to get people up in space?
Galactic. Virgin
Atlantic.
Virgin Galactic.
Where no man hath been before.
No.
So yeah, that's what we've got in store for us tonight. But first of all, we're going to go with the Sergeant White challenge once more. So in our last podcast, I introduced the idea that every week I'm going to give Sergeant White some facts and he's going to let me know whether he already knew that. Because first of all, it's always good learning some new interesting things about space and about satellites, but does Sergeant White know the answer to everything?
No, not at all.
Know. So here's our first fact, Sergeant White.
Yes.
Did you know that satellites travel at 18,000 miles per hour?
No, I didn't know anything could travel at 18,000 miles an hour.
Well, neither did I. And when I heard that, I was a little bit shocked. And do you know how many times that means satellites travel around the circumference of the Earth in one day?
I could figure it out. So I'm going to say around... so an hour. So maybe
That's
20,
in one day.
21?
14.
14.
14.
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy fast. I can't even fathom that in my mind. Cannot even fathom that.
So
in
technically
my mind.
today, probably a satellite's probably passed over us about 8 times already.
8 times already. The second fact, Sergeant White. So obviously, the satellites that we know in the Earth's orbit collect information. That's what they're for. They collect and disseminate information. But if you were to collect and download all of that information that satellites collect in 1 year and put them onto DVDs, like if you put all those DVDs in a pile, stack them up, it would be 4 times the height of the Empire State Building.
That doesn't seem massive.
Oh, that wasn't the reaction I expected.
Do you
Think
know
about that.
Do you know that if you
that.
download the entire internet onto one source, like an SD card or a USB, whatever, providing we have one that was big enough, in terms of how much, like they figured out in terms of how much, say a 32 gig memory card weighs between when it's full and empty, the entire internet would weigh the same as a strawberry.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, well, that's a cooler fact than mine, so I'm upset. I thought that was very impressive.
Yeah.
4 times the height of the Empire State
I thought you were going to say
Building.
it was going to get to the moon.
Think how thin a DVD is. Like a little less than a centimetre thick, especially if they're Blu-ray. Anyway, final fact before we move on to the main event. Did you know that Sputnik 1 was the size of a beach ball?
No.
Yeah, that's how big Sputnik 1 was.
I always thought at least
I thought it would just be this massive thing.
yoga. At least yoga ball.
At least a yoga ball size.
I was thinking more like, one of those big hippo sacks that you get sand delivered in or gravel.
Oh, yeah.
Hefty. One of them that big.
So, Sputnik 1, size of a beach ball.
Oh, it's quite underwhelming.
Throw
really,
it on the
isn't it?
beach. So yeah, those are the facts. I think I wowed you. So we're going to move straight into the main content. As we've said before, everything we're talking about tonight is on the Bronze Space Syllabus. So if you wanted to update the facts, get some knowledge for yourself, if you're completing the Bronze Space Syllabus, then Go Any Last Words is perfect.
Yeah.
So first of all, we are going to talk about what defines a satellite. So obviously, throughout the decades, more and more satellites have been introduced into the atmosphere, but the term satellite can talk about heavenly or artificial bodies. So the moon, what do you think the moon is? A heavenly or an artificial body?
Heavenly.
Yeah, exactly. A heavenly body. So the moon is the Earth's only natural satellite. But now we have thousands of satellites in our orbit, and their roles vary very widely. So communications, so your phone signals and things like that, navigation aids, Google Maps, benefits.
GPS.
Yeah, GPS, yeah.
What does GPS stand for?
Don't tell me. Should I know this?
I feel like...
Hey Google, what does GPS stand for? Global... I can tell you this... Hey Google, stop. I can tell you out of my own brain that GPS stands for Global Positioning System. And that is done through the magic of satellites. Other functions of satellites can be sort of for military use, military intelligence, and just down to sort of the weather.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned before, Sputnik 1 was launched in 1957. And then, since 1957, over 10,000 satellites have been launched into space.
That's a lot. How many is that, like, averaging per year?
I'm trying to think. So,
57, so call that like 60 years ago.
So, 60 years.
So 10,000 divided by 60. It's kind of like...
Help me out here.
So, like... 10,000.
1,000.
Like 60?
Sure. A
no,
lot.
That's way more than 60.
I did a film degree. I didn't do a maths degree. What we're thinking. Not a clue. But at the end of the day, we know that it's a lot.
Yeah.
So obviously, the satellites get put into the atmosphere. But what if it's used for a piece of technology or a project or something, and then it's no longer useful? That piece of technology is no longer being used. We can't just get a truck to come and pick it up and bring it back, So obviously they either burn up in the Earth's atmosphere or they become pieces of space debris. So there are 10,000 satellites around the atmosphere, but only 2,700 of them are actually in use at the moment.
Did you know that the first song...
You've come pre-prepared with
well,
some
no, this is not actually really
bite-sized
to do with
facts.
satellites, but just when you talked about the fact that if the technology outdates them, that they can't be used anymore.
Yeah.
So the first ever song to be played planet to planet was Happy Birthday, because there was a rover. I'm not sure whether this is the Mars rover or this is a rover on a different planet.
Yeah.
But it was to signify happy birthday for that specific piece of equipment. It played it to itself, and that's the first ever song that's been played planet to planet. But also, to help with its repairs, it takes selfies of itself every day. So it takes a selfie of one arm, a selfie of the other arm.
How do I look?
One of the front of it, one of the back, one of the back, so that the engineers back on Earth can fix it. And what they do is they put on this VR headset and they fix it in VR.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That is so cool.
So it literally takes a few pics of itself every day, sends them back to Earth.
You up?
Yeah.
That is crazy. That's so cool. Well, didn't the Mars rover send a message to Earth and it just sounded really depressed? Didn't the Mars rover, with the one that was destroyed or the one that died, didn't it say, it's so cool?
Well, we have a whole podcast coming up about Mars.
Oh, there we go. Oh, we can even play some transmissions.
The Red Planet, as it's known.
Exciting stuff. Anyway, back to debris. Never thought I'd say that. So obviously, these unused, non-functioning satellites will just be floating around space, and then once their use has ended for us, they become debris. And those can often collide with each other, and then that causes smaller debris. So basically, the atmosphere above us is just littered with pieces of machinery that have collided together, or explosions may have happened, and then each time one piece of debris collides with another, that in turn will get smaller and smaller. But we will talk about what I've just described, which is called the Kessler effect. We'll talk about that later on.
Interesting.
So, as I said, it is defunct satellites, and the United States Strategic Command are tracking over 26,000 larger pieces of junk, including those 2,700 operational. And some items that are high up in the orbit, that have been put at a really high geostationary position, they will circle the Earth for thousands and thousands of years.
Thousands?
Thousands of years they will stay up there.
I thought it was going to be like hundreds.
Well, you'd think so, but if it's been placed away from everything else, there is a much smaller likelihood that it will bump into anything else. So it will just continue because the obviously there's no oxygen in the atmosphere, so it won't rust or things like that. It's crazy.
It won't oxidize, will it?
Exactly. Yeah.
True.
So here is a fact which shocked me. Mm-hmm. It is estimated that there are around 130 million fragments of debris between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter in size, and almost 1 million pieces in the size range of 1 to 10 centimeters.
That's like nearly the population of America. Could each have a
That's
little
a good
piece.
way to. That's a good way to sort of visualize it.
It's less than the population of America, but I mean,
it's still like that's the sort of range we're talking about. 130 million between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter. So that's the size of what, like a
your fingers basically touching.
Yeah.
To like
a sort of a chia seed.
Yeah.
There's 130 million chia seeds flying up there.
I mean, that's probably not that big, really, is it? It's probably 100. No, it's not 130 million chia seeds in a pack. Probably about 1 million.
There is, Sergeant White. We look up to the stars and we see a vast expanse of nothing, but really it's filled with everything. It's filled with debris and metal.
Everything.
I was trying to be poetic.
So say a French bread.
Ooh,
Maybe
hopefully.
not.
Bring it down to me.
Yeah.
So on to the Kessler effect. So in 1978, a NASA space debris expert, a specific job. Imagine having that on your LinkedIn. His name was
Imagine having that on your LinkedIn with a lisp.
NASA space debris expert.
Yeah.
Don Kessler. So it was Mr. Kessler that noticed the growing problem of space debris and predicted that once it passed a critical mass, the total amount of space debris will just keep on increasing. So once it goes past that critical mass, I'm not really sure what the term critical mass means. I know that's more of a physics term. But probably this is a figure that he's calculated where once it goes past this point, that's when, it starts to go downhill. So after that critical mass, when the objects collide, they'll produce lots and lots of smaller pieces of debris, which will in turn collide with each other. And it will just get smaller and smaller and smaller. And if that continues, it may start to become unviable to launch anything new into space because the likelihood of damage is just going to increase. The number of pieces of space debris orbiting our Earth have increased by over 50% during the last 5 years. Oh, so you can see that that's increasing at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
As we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, things in our orbit travel at extremely fast speeds. What did I say before? It was 18,000 miles per hour. 18,000 miles
an
hour. Incomparable speed. An item in low Earth orbit has an average impact velocity of 21,600 miles per hour. So the closer it is to the Earth's orbit, the faster it's going to travel.
Gets that spin, doesn't it? Suck spin
exactly.
motion where it gets like... That's why you burn up on entry because you get speedier, don't you? With the gravity.
Well, that's it. So the impact velocity is considerably more than the average speed. So 21,600 miles per hour, that is 12 times faster than the fastest bullet there is.
Oh. Wow.
Cray.
Yeah, that is fast.
This means that even the smallest piece of space debris can cause really significant damage to active satellites and even astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station. So it could result that if there was too much debris in space, they wouldn't be able to come back, or more cosmonauts and astronauts wouldn't be able to re-enter. Spacewalk as well. They'll try and, they'll take off their helmet, get a bit of fresh air, and they'll go... because of all the debris.
Because of the debris.
Not because of the lack of oxygen. So the high-speed collisions with the smaller pieces of debris, it causes damage which is similar to sandblasting. So as you said before, like the sand. So it's
like being in a sandstorm.
Yeah, exactly.
They hurt. You ever been in a sandstorm?
Never, no. Have you?
Painful. Not in a big sandstorm, but I've been on a windy beach. Close enough.
We thought that you'd see in the dunes of the Sahara, but no.
I
was in Whitley Bay.
Bit of a gust, a blowing. It's prickly.
But that can cause sort of over a long amount of time.
Like 1,000 hedgehogs. 1,000 chogs on your body. Yeah.
So that causes damage like sandblasting, and that especially happens to solar panels or optical components of telescopes, that they cannot be protected with shielding. So these small collisions, they happen fairly regularly on the ISS, but the ISS has been shielded to protect from the smallest pieces by something called Whipple shielding. So Whipple shielding breaks up and disperses debris, spreading the energy over a larger area, so it's more likely to cause less damage. Whipple shielding, I didn't know that.
Whipple shielding.
Whipple, it's a good name for a cat. Think of that when I get another cat.
Mr. Whipple.
Mr. Whipple, get your ice cream and your chia seeds. So the larger pieces of space debris hitting the ISS, that could obviously have catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
That could tear right through the Whipple shielding, right through their overall shielding. So the ISS and some other satellites can dodge these larger pieces by changing their position whilst they're in orbit. So I remember you mentioning last week that some rockets can sort of change direction or things like that. So they'll probably have little motors or engines which...
They have rockets.
Well, exactly. It all comes full circle.
It does. They have rockets. They use the plasma type. The plasma, where they did the plasma exchange. They exchange the fuel into plasma to do a short, sharp little... And then they're...
A little burst of sort of movement.
Nudge yourself out of the way by like a centimetre or whatever.
Because sometimes it only comes down to that amount of space, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're not going too far.
So they can change where they are whilst they're in orbit. And ground-based facilities like the Haystack Observatory in the USA, you can use the radar techniques to monitor the position of the larger pieces of space junk. So they are constantly keeping an eye on them. It's not like they're all unaccounted for. Luckily, places like the Haystack Observatory, they look for that needle in a haystack. That must be why they named themselves Haystack.
The Haystack. Wow.
It's pretty cool. So now we're going to talk more about the efforts that the European Space Agency are making to clean up the debris that we've got in the atmosphere. Because, as I said before, it would be a hard feat, but it's not impossible. There are efforts that they can make to try and reduce that so we can continue with our scientific research in the atmosphere and beyond. Next, we're going to talk about the efforts made by the European Space Agency to try and clean up the debris in the atmosphere. Because, as I said before, a lot of it won't cause a lot of damage, but over time, it's going to reduce our ability to be able to go into the atmosphere, go into space, and continue our scientific
endeavours.
Yes, exactly, endeavours and discoveries. So, as I said before, the debris levels have increased by over 50% in the low Earth orbit, or LEO, over the last 5 years. And that is set to continue if nothing is done. So we can't just continue as we are. Exactly. So to achieve this new, to reduce the debris, new guidelines have been introduced to limit the production of new space debris, but not all countries are following the same rules, which seems counterproductive to me. We should be working together as a nation, as a United Nations of a planet, to sort of reduce the amount of debris
the planet nations.
Together. I'm trying to be inspirational here. They all follow different rules according to their governmental country legislation. Who knows? So in the low Earth atmosphere region, the European Space Agency recommend that satellites and other large pieces of space junk should re-enter the atmosphere within 25 years after the end of their operational life, by becoming deorbited. So the satellite would often need their own fuel resources to change course to be able to do that.
Yeah, push itself back in.
Yeah, exactly. But if they've already depleted that source, there's nothing we can do about it.
I suppose as well, how long does fuel last?
Exactly. Is there an expiration date when you're in space?
Probably some lack of probably has a half-life, doesn't it?
Become less effective, maybe.
Yeah.
Exactly. So some satellites in really, really low orbits can be done passively. So atmospheric drag means that these satellites re-enter the atmosphere around a year after the end of their operational life. So you don't need the fuel for that. Atmospheric drag sounds like a very fun drag competition. A space drag competition.
The atmospheric drag.
So other satellites should be expected to move to a graveyard orbit where they will not interfere with operational satellites. Graveyard orbit. I like that term.
So they just get pushed out to a different corner of space.
Yeah, so they won't be like the ones that were really high up. They'll be out of the way of anything else. These ones will move to a graveyard orbit where it's probably been very, very highly planned, where they definitely won't collide with other ones.
Yeah, so I suppose you just end up trying to avoid one large block of debris instead of 10,000 small blocks of debris.
Exactly. So the chances would be reduced. So there are some efforts that the ESA are completing where they're focusing on their efforts to target the dead satellites with the aim of catching them with robotic arms.
Aye.
So like the...
Yoink.
Yes, what are they called? The grabber machines? That's what I used to call them. Like the claw machines. The claw. It's basically just doing that, but in the atmosphere. So they would spear them with harpoons, grab them with robotic arms, or drag them down into the Earth's atmosphere with solar sails tethers. And there are plans to zap small pieces with lasers as well.
Oh.
What do you think would be the most effective way? Like robotic arms or lasers?
Well, the small pieces were lasers probably, but
wouldn't that just make the sort of tiny size ones, and couldn't they cause sandblasting?
Well, no, because I think they'll be even smaller than that. I think they'll be doing it with really, really small, like tiny. But then I suppose maybe then they could create something else to pick up all the really, really tiny bits.
Yeah, like
a large net.
A galactic Hoover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, do you know that in like, so I think it's Mount Everest.
Mm-hmm.
In order to climb Mount Everest, on the way back down, you have to bring a certain amount of rubbish back with you.
Oh, really? Right, okay.
A certain amount of kilograms. I think it's like 7 kilograms worth of rubbish you have to bring back with you. So maybe they could do that. If you send up a satellite, you have to bring the same weight back.
If you're going to bring a 7-ton satellite out there, you need to bring 7 tons back, sunshine.
Exactly.
Or there'll be no deal.
Yeah.
To be honest, that is a good a good rule. I think that would be good. So we're going to go through some of the concepts and projects that have been completed. So the UK sort of program to try and reduce the amount of debris in the atmosphere is called Remove Debris.
They went pretty
very creative name,
didn't they?
Us Brits.
Yeah.
So this Remove Debris is a satellite, and that was deployed from the International Space Station. So there was a satellite to try and remove debris called Remove Debris. Very self-explanatory stuff, this.
Yeah.
The European Space Agency came up with a concept for a future mission called ED-Orbit, which was actually first designed to target a satellite that is derelict that was owned by the European Space Agency in a low orbit to catch it and then burn it up in a controlled atmospheric re-entry.
That's good.
So it's
getting their own back.
Well, exactly.
They're like, that, my bad, guys.
They're claiming it.
We're going to get that out there for you. We'll bring it back.
So that was their aim, was to sort of capture their own satellite and then just let it burn up naturally in the atmosphere, and then it won't be a problem anymore. So since then, the project has been expanded, and now the plan includes the development of a space servicing vehicle that can refuel, refurbish, or reboost satellites that are already in the orbit.
It's like the AA.
Yeah. It's like the upcycling AA for satellites.
Like when my battery was flat in my car and the AA came over. They're like, oh, need a bit of fuel?
We'll zhuzh this satellite up a little bit and bring her back out there. Get ready, O2. You've got a new satellite coming. So I think that is a really sort of eco-friendly way to do it. Yeah. You don't have to worry about, remaking it. You've got the tools there in the atmosphere.
Recycle, reuse, reduce.
I like that one. And the ED-Orbit satellite is actually scheduled for launch in 2025, so we can look out for that. I don't think any of the cadets listening will still be a cadet by then, mate. Well, hopefully there will be. So that's my favourite, the ED-Orbit one, owned by the European Space Agency. So now we're going to talk about the actual different orbits that we have in the atmosphere and what type of satellites would be in that orbit. When you first hear the word orbit, what do you think?
Something that's being maintained within a gravitational pull of something else, where the path it takes is very similar.
Yeah, that's what I would think. That's like the assumption that I get. So the orbit, think of it as like a path. So that is the path that the object takes in space when it goes around a star. So simply saying, that was pretty much what you said. Yeah. And that's due to that object's gravitational... No, sorry, it's due to the object that it moves around.
Yeah, their gravitational pull.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like on Earth when the moon affects the tides.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of the gravitational pull.
Because of the gravitational pull. So the gravitational force of the Earth causes satellites or spacecrafts or space debris to orbit around it. Yeah. So obviously there are a lot of things to consider when deciding what orbit would be most suitable for a satellite. So would military intelligence would need to be lower down so it can actually spot misnomers and suspicious activity on the surface of the Earth. So now we're going to talk through the different types of orbits and the satellites that are found within them. So the first one is the geostationary orbit. So they circle the Earth at 35,786 kilometres above the equator. So it's specifically an equator level one, but think about the line around the Earth of the equator and then expand it by 35,786 kilometres.
Yeah, like a donut around the Earth.
Exactly. Always where the equator is.
Yes.
So that's keeping pace with the rotation of the Earth. So any satellites within that orbit, they complete a full orbit in 24 hours and appear to observers on the ground as being fixed. So it doesn't seem like it's moving when you're looking up and you see
so
it.
it spins with the the
Yeah,
Earth.
exactly. So it just accompanies the Earth on its rotation. There are only 3 satellites of the same type in geostationary orbit, and they're needed to achieve near global coverage, except for some largely uninhabited areas at high latitudes near the North and South Poles, if a satellite operator requires this.
Right.
Penguins.
Penguins need one.
Pardon?
The penguins need one. They're the only people I can think in the North and South Poles.
People. The polar bears.
Yeah. 4G sucks here. Let's pull some resources together.
Ian, can you get this photo downloaded? No, mate, there's no signal.
Get onto a D orbit. D orbit, whatever it is. ED orbit. ED orbit sounds like an old lady to me. ED orbit.
Maybe they named it after a girl called Edie. Changed the world.
ED orbit.
ED orbit. You know her well. Anyway, back to GEOs. So they're used by satellites. That specific type of orbit are used by satellites that need to stay over a particular place on Earth.
Yeah.
So that means that communications antenna on the ground can be permanently positioned, and they do not need to track where the satellite is in the sky because it's always at the same fixed point following the Earth's orbit.
Makes sense. I mean, if you were a British telecoms company, you wouldn't want your satellite over Africa, would you?
Yeah, or constantly moving sort of not akin to the Earth's rotation.
Hold on, guys. 3 more hours, it'll be back.
So examples of satellites that are in this orbit are sort of for satellite television, for monitoring weather. They're the ones that are mainly found in there. Yeah. So the next one is medium Earth orbit, and that describes the range of orbits between low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit. So it's the meat in the sandwich.
The middle, it's the medium.
Yeah, exactly. So the most common height for satellites in the medium Earth orbit is around 20,000 kilometres. So the satellites that are found in there are most often positioned so as many satellites as possible are available to view. Satellite navigation receivers, they need to be able to receive a signal from at least 4 or 5 satellites to work correctly. So the use of these of this orbit is relatively limited, however, because of the high radiation levels in that area. So it can affect the lifespan and usability of the satellites themselves. Right. So low Earth orbit, they're relatively close to the Earth's surface, so they're at the closest, between 200 and 1,000 kilometres. Though some satellites can actually be below this, so that is RLEO, really low Earth orbit, which doesn't exist, but I've just made it up. Copyright me.
Right.
So it's easier to launch a satellite into this lowest one, obviously, because it requires less power, less efforts, and it's easier to transmit the data from a shorter distance. From these satellites within the low Earth orbit, high-resolution images can be taken using a satellite because of how close they are to Earth. So probably satellites that took pictures for Google Maps and Google Earth, they were in the low Earth orbit.
Right.
There is also much less of a sort of latency or delay between transmissions compared to the ones that are higher up. And the ISS is an example of a satellite in the low Earth orbit. For some reason, I thought it would be higher up for some reason. Yeah. But I guess when you see sort of footage of the astronauts at the ISS, you get a pretty...
They've got quite a good view of Earth, haven't they? We're not a dot.
Yeah, exactly.
More like a large plum.
So the ISS's orbit altitude is 408 kilometres. And this height was chosen as it's easier and cheaper for astronauts and cosmonauts to get to and from because of the shorter distance.
Well, you pick a house close to home, don't you?
Well, exactly.
Reduce journey time.
Well, the commute's a bit shorter, so you know. So a satellite in the lower orbit area, it can see less of the Earth's surface at any time than the one in the higher orbit.
Yeah.
So you need more satellites for continuous coverage of a given area because you can't cover.
You can't see the back and the front, can you?
Well, exactly. So the atmospheric conditions in the low Earth orbit can affect the position of the satellites, and most need to boost their orbit several times a year using the fuel reserves. So you need more fuel, but obviously you don't need to use as much power to get the fuel up there or to have more fuel already loaded into the satellite.
6 and 2 3s.
Exactly, yeah. So despite those limitations, putting a satellite into the low Earth orbit is one of the most popular choices, and more satellites are being deployed in that region of space. These satellites can tilt their plane of orbit so they do not have to follow the equator, and that means that that will open up so many more route options to those satellites because they can change the angle.
Yeah, they can change where they're going.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically the short and long of satellites within the orbit, which is... I've had a lot of fun with it. I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I've learned quite a bit about satellites and...
Yeah, exactly. So we've covered debris and we've covered satellites and their uses and where they're positioned. But before we finish, I just want to go through these pioneers of space travel. Can you guess what the name of the dog is?
No, not a clue.
Come on, think of dog names. Think of a spacey dog. You won't get
Cosmo.
It's a Soviet space dog. Cosmo is a cute name for a dog.
Cosmo is Soviet. Cosmonauts instead of astronauts.
It's Laika, which is a very cute name.
How would I have got that?
I don't know. I just wanted to add a bit of fun.
Right.
So Laika was the first animal in space and one of the first living things to actually orbit the Earth. And Laika's journey into space in 1957 actually gave scientists really, really important information which they needed to send humans into space eventually.
I suppose if she was living, then that was probably the first bit of
She
information.
was living, which is a relief for me, because they could say the first animal in space. I mean, it wasn't alive, but it doesn't really count. I think that Laika probably contributed towards the cosmonauts and the USSR trying to get into space first, the space race.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Laika's efforts were futile, and I don't think she should have even bothered. But I think that is a really cool first, having Laika the space dog. And I wish that I could show you this image for those listening to the podcast.
Have a Google.
There is a sweet little image of Laika strapped up on this little contraption. And I just love her. And apparently when they launched the rocket, Laika was terrified and her heart rate became 3 times faster than normal.
I mean, you
Poor
would
thing.
be. You would be.
I would be. I'd be palpitating. You can't imagine this cute little dog. So she did eventually calm down and began eating some food. But then apparently during the launch, some of the thermal insulation on the spacecraft actually came loose.
No.
So the temperature dropped. No, it increased even to over 40 degrees Celsius.
Oh.
And then,
She won't be used to that. She's Russian.
Well, that's the tragic thing. So within 5 to 7 hours into the flight, Laika died of heat exhaustion.
Oh, so Laika was only briefly the first living dog in
So
space.
she was, I mean, yeah. I feel so sad now.
Yeah.
I don't want to end this on a low. Well, we're all going to remember Laika. I think that she was a hero, and to be honest, she didn't ask to do it.
No.
She probably didn't want to do it. She probably wanted to stay in front of the fire at home. But she was a brave dog, and she will be remembered. R.I.P. Laika.
I think there's actually, I think there might be a monument actually for space, for the animals that gave their lives for space.
I think there is.
I think there is, yeah.
So there'll be
a Laika
somewhere there's going to be a
statue out there
statue for
somewhere.
Laika. So rest in peace, Laika.
Yeah.
Hope you're chewing on the best bone.
Yeah.
Moving on to the first woman in space. This was another first by the USSR.
Again, they're just like, if we can't get up there first, we're going to do every other first.
I admire their candor and I admire their ambition.
They're going to be like, first marshmallow in
Beach ball
space.
sized. We put a marshmallow in space. What did you do? So the first woman in space is Valentina Tereshkova.
Yes.
Which I think is a brilliant feat. She spent 70 hours in orbit, circling the Earth 48 times in Vostok 6, and became the only woman to fly solo in space. And she was 26 years old,
That's
only
quite,
a year older than me.
She was going at a canny speed.
I know,
70
right?
hours and she went round nearly 50 times.
God, you'd be a bit dizzy, wouldn't you?
That'd be like 2 times an hour.
So, like, her origins, she started as a parachutist and joined the parachuting club and trained every weekend. And it was actually her parachuting experience which helped her secure her first position.
Because they thought if this goes a bit...
If this goes Wrong. Then we know that you've got a parachute as a backup plan.
Yeah.
So Valentina, get it ready. So the actual flight was in 16th of June 1963. Her rocket was launched successfully and she began the orbit. And yeah, I think that's brilliant. So obviously because she's a woman, that has a lot of political significance, and she's still a national hero.
Especially in Russia.
Especially in Russia, which can be quite a conservative place. But she's still a celebrity today, and she did I watched a little bit of this earlier. She did a really good interview in 2015 with the BBC. You can watch it online. And she said, one cannot deny the great role... See, I messed that up. One cannot deny the great role women have played in the world community. My flight was yet another impetus to continue this female introduction. So...
Our English is pretty good.
It's really good.
Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. I'm quite inspired by that story. Next on to the first Briton in space. Now, the first Briton in space was also a woman, Helen Sharman. And she actually visited the Mir space station, is it? In 1991. And she spent 8 days in space, mostly on the space station. And she also conducted medical and agricultural tests.
Testing those plants.
Whilst in orbit.
Bit of wheat and barley.
So, yeah, and after doing that, she is now the operations manager for the Department of Chemistry at Imperial College London. So if you ever go on Cadets, if you ever go on to study there, you should find her in the Department of Chemistry and ask her some questions about her experience. I think that's really cool. Something definitely for the CV. Finally, before we finish, we're going to talk about the first space tourist, Dennis Tito. Now, it took him so long to actually get up in space because he asked so many different companies to go up there, and a lot of them denied it.
Yeah.
NASA criticised the Russian Space Federation, and they said it was inappropriate for them to take a tourist into space.
Well, I suppose it takes a lot of training to be an astronaut. It probably undermines the safety protocol they have to go through.
I mean, I understand that, but whilst Dennis was up there, he himself also completed research and studies related to his job. So they call him a space tourist, but he's not just like you or I, Sergeant White. Yeah. He is also someone who can contribute to research, and he followed all the right steps. He trained for a year in Moscow to launch at the Mir space station, but that mission was cancelled when it was finally decided to deorbit Mir in early 2001. And instead, Tito joined 2 cosmonauts on the Soyuz TM-32 mission to the ISS.
Oh, it gets the ISS there. That's much better.
Which I think is so cool. And he conducted experiments whilst he was up there that would be vital to his company and probably also important.
What was his company?
Let me double check. Well, he worked as an aerospace engineer in NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab.
Oh, so he worked for NASA.
Exactly, but they didn't want him up in space.
So how did he get up to space?
Well, I think that he still had ties to NASA.
So he paid them?
It's basically a money job because he did find a finance company in 1972 and he became very, very successful in the industry, but it was always space that was in the back of his mind.
I was going to say, because I feel like buying a ticket to space is more expensive.
I think that, unfortunately, the everyday person, such as everyone listening, you couldn't just book a return to space. I think that it does cost... He did spend over £20 million to travel there.
I was about to say, you don't earn £20 million at NASA being an engineer.
Exactly. So it was a little bit privileged there. So yeah, he hopes that many more people will get to experience space travel in the future, but he didn't mention that you need £20 million to do it.
Might be cheaper now. You never know.
Yeah, maybe
might have a sale on.
Yeah, 50% off.
Post-COVID clearance.
COVID special. So yeah, those were our pioneers, and that in turn ends our podcast for this week.
It's been a wild one.
It has been a wild one. I mean, did you learn anything new, Sergeant?
I did. I mean, I learned that Laika didn't make it. Rest in peace.
So sad.
I've learnt about the problems that space debris faces, and they say that there are jobs now that won't be. There are jobs every 10 years. There are jobs that won't have been a thing 10 years previously.
Yeah.
So things like, like off the bat, things I can think of is like social media influencers obviously didn't exist before, but now, probably in 10 years' time, people will be something, engineers on space debris collectors.
Yeah, exactly.
Space rubbish men.
When the deorbit satellite launches in 2025, there will be roles created specifically for that role, which didn't exist.
Yeah. So
several decades ago.
Cadets listening, you could put your money in this now.
It's very exciting.
Get to the stocks.
All of you lot listening now, you will probably have jobs which when we're old and grey, we will be shocked and surprised to hear about. Which this whole subject of space, I just don't want to stop talking about it because it is really sort of inspiring and interesting and fun. But thank you for watching. You can follow us on Spotify, and our podcasts are released every week. And we will also premiere our stream on the 361 Gateshead YouTube channel. But thank you for watching, and we will see you next week. What are we going to go over next week?
Next week is our first air crash investigation, and we will be talking about the Air Asia crash.
Oh, wow. And you'll be leading that one.
And I will be leading that one.
Brilliant. Well, I hope you enjoyed, for everyone listening, and we will see you next week. This has been Got Any Last Words? Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Got Any Last Words, a weekly podcast for Air Cadets, released every Friday. Got Any Last Words was written, produced, and presented by Sergeant White and CI Me of 361 Gateshead Squadron. Sound effects by Motion Array. Podcast theme is Grow by KV.